I wanted to really start out by asking, kind of assess, we've done this panel, this conference for a few years now, and a lot has happened over the last year, a lot of very high profile cases, and just get an assessment of what has changed, how big and what is the breadth and the sort of depth of cybersecurity risk in the private sector, and how has that changed over the last year? And maybe I can start off with you, Ellen, and then just ask all of you to just describe basically what's happened over the last year.
Okay, well, in the payments industry, as most of you all probably know, we're the pioneers of cybersecurity. We've been on the front lines of cyber attack for at least a decade. So this past year is a huge year for us on the advancement side, because we're finally getting to the point where the entire world will be adopting EMV chip technology, which actually devalues the data in the hands of the merchants by sending a one-time code. So the US today, actually October 1, is the day of the liability shift, which is the incentive that we put in place for adoption of chip cards in the US. And I'm pleased to say that we already have over 150
press conference and in a press release issued by the White House between Presidents Xi and Obama, there is the possibility, and I leave it only as the possibility, that American businesses may see a slight decrease in intrusion pressure from Chinese military and Ministry of State Security hacking teams going after their economic data. I say it's a possibility because I'll let you know how it goes. I don't expect to see any real changes in the next weeks or maybe even months, but maybe in 6 months to a year, I'll be able to tell you whether that agreement panned out.
Great.
I think what we've seen of great significance in the last year is not only a continuing barrage of major attacks, but also a demonstration that the attacks aren't always for money, which had been the case for years. But the Sony example shows it also could be with the intent to devastate a company and expose and embarrass a company. And the other major change has also been that senior executives and board members are increasingly being held accountable for their preparedness as well as their response. And that emphasizes the importance of being smart about these issues and preparing about these issues on a company level, both from the suits brought by regulators as well as by private civil litigants.
Great. I'd love to get back to Sony for sure and about accountability. Ellen, if you can give a sense, you just talked a little bit about the advancements. Give us a sense of actually how often does a company like Sony encounter on the defensive side being attacked? How much growth has there been in the attack side?
Oh, the attacks keep coming thick and fast. They're getting more and more frequent, more and more sophisticated. Richard mentioned the attacks around malicious destruction. So we're seeing a lot more DDoS attacks, denial of service attacks, in much greater force as well. So trying to overwhelm the defenses against DDoS. We're seeing a lot more of that. Now, the interesting thing is when you think about the nature of the attacks, people, when I say they're more sophisticated, they're actually, in our industry at least, not sophisticated in the way they get in. 3 phases of an attack: entry, the entry point, the theft or destruction within, and then, in our case, the monetization of the data. The entry point is generally not sophisticated at all. I just want you all to know that. Simple things like default passwords, failure to control administrative privileges, vendor access to your systems that we all heard about in certain cases. These are things that this is how, in our industry at least, they're mostly getting in. So there's a lot of things that could be done by basic cyber hygiene to protect ourselves.
That's a great example. You know, Richard, we talked a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the latest efforts to protect consumers, maybe in the entry side or throughout this chain that Ellen just described?
My thesis around protecting consumers is something I put out in a Brookings piece about a month ago, and it's summarized by the pithy title, "If you can't protect it, don't collect it." Mm-hmm. We've seen so many organizations, both in the private sector and the public sector, who are essentially face no cost, at least no overt cost, for having data, and in many cases for losing that data. I've personally been affected by multiple healthcare breaches, by OPM. The Chinese have my fingerprints. You name some type of data about me, generally somebody else has it who I didn't approve of. So my recommendation, and this is where I'm really happy to see Visa pushing the adoption of alternative technologies, tokenization and such. If you don't need the data for a business purpose, don't store it. I'll give you a great example from yesterday. We just ordered a new kitchen table and chairs for my house, and I paid 1/3 up front with a credit card, and I had to pay 2/3 upon delivery. On the phone, I talked to the vendor, and they said, well, we need you to pay the last 2/3. And of course, I thought, well, I thought I already had done that, but okay, fine, whatever. I said, well, do you have my credit card number on file? And you know what they said? Yes. They said no. I was thrilled. I was happy to give them my credit card number. Now, by the way, this is one area where the electronic chip part isn't going to help you. I still had to give them the number over the phone. I would have done the same thing if I had to do it online. So while it is a step in the right direction to have chip technology, we still have many other parts of the retail chain that need to be fixed.
Judy, what are you seeing on that? And are you seeing companies actually abstaining from collecting more information? And what specifically are they deciding not to collect if they are moving this direction?
It depends on the company. There's a broad range where some companies are savvy to these concerns and they are taking to heart the, are we only collecting the information we need and are we doing all that we can to ensure that it is protected and keeping it only as long as we need it, which is very good practices. But other companies aren't even sure what they're collecting, and it underscores the importance of both what Ellen and Richard said in terms of companies being aware of the importance of cybersecurity governance at the senior management level. You need executives looking at this and board members ensuring that the executives are looking at it in the right way to make sure that companies throughout the enterprise, from marketing, from HR, from the business, from legal, and all through to manufacturing, know what's being collected, what are the vulnerabilities, who are our third parties. Sometimes that's even just a lengthy question that's difficult to ask. And then underlying that, do they all know that our policy is, first of all, do we have a policy? Second, do they know we're only collecting what we need? And we're using, as Ellen mentioned, these very simple ways of, are there adequate firewalls? Are there proper passwords? And a systematic way of good cybersecurity hygiene.
Can I just add one thing?
Sure.
The default stance for many companies, especially in the social media space, is to collect everything because it's easier than figuring out what you really need and what you don't need. And the reason is because there's no cost. There's a great example from Facebook. I love Facebook. I don't use it. However, I am on Facebook, but I don't use it. There was a case, I did that to prevent somebody from squatting and taking my identity. So there was a case in Europe where a person wanted to find out, what does Facebook have on me? So he essentially did a FOIA request, you might call it that, for Facebook. He got back hundreds of pages of everything he had ever clicked on or looked at for the entire time he had been on Facebook. That needs to change.
As you mentioned, Judy, oftentimes businesses don't even know what they're collecting, and they don't know necessarily what the risks are involved. And I wonder, Ellen, can you talk about at Visa, what are some of the more recent efforts to remove some of that risk from those, especially the smaller businesses, the merchants?
Yeah, so in the payments industry, it's even worse than this. It's not about what you store. We've been prohibiting storage of the most sensitive information for many years. They're collecting, the criminals will get in and take the information as it passes through your system. So we want to devalue the data across the entire payment chain. Why? Because protecting 38 million merchant locations, we just don't think that's a happening thing. So I could say we have a vision. Or I have a dream of how this is going to look. And it's going to look this way in the relatively near future, where we have the technologies such that the information passing through the merchant environment will not be reusable to commit fraud at all. So how do we do this? First with the chip, second with tokenization, which Richard mentioned. It changes out the account number for something called a token. It looks like an account number, 16 digits, but it's not an account number. And then you use a service, provided it could be by us, our competitors, independent companies, to translate that back into an account number before it reaches the bank. So this already exists. It's in use in Apple Pay, Samsung Pay, Google Pay, Android Pay, I guess we call it. All the pays, those account numbers are not being sent to the merchant, so it's completely secure. So tokenization, and then the third piece, in the meantime, before all that's in place, merchants can adopt what we call point-to-point encryption so that the information is encrypted the moment it enters their system.
Could I add just
Please.
one point on payments? I went through an exercise the other day where I changed all the passwords on every financial related account just because, it's how I like to spend my free time. And I was amazed to find which banks in financial institutions, offered which levels of notification. Some told me, you just changed your password from this location, from this IP address. If this is unauthorized, please contact us. Others I could have been on Mars for all they cared, or it seemed. So I recommend you go through your banks and your financial institutions and take a look at what levels of alerting they allow you. I got a notification yesterday, for example, because I have everything turned up to 11, from American Express saying that somebody had used my Amex card in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania at the AT&T store. So immediately I got an email about it. I logged on and said, I suspect this is fraudulent, and it's probably going to be knocked down, and I'll get a new card pretty soon. Right. So if you don't have the capability to do that with a bank or a credit card, or what, I can tell you, I wouldn't tell you on stage which ones I like, but that's a good differentiating factor, and it's a way to beat the criminals before all these new technologies arrive.
Absolutely right. These alerts are fantastic, real-time alerts that come to you the moment your card is used or your account is accessed from a bank. We found in our system that when that's implemented, it reduces fraud on that account, those accounts by 40%. Wow.
But this is a very important area for companies to be aware of in the shifting landscape of liability and accountability, and making sure that they do have robust security practices and also notification practices in place, and that they are offering that to their consumers, to their customers in a thoughtful and effective way.
Absolutely. We do have one question. Allison, please.
Hi. Chief Information Security Officers are becoming common in corporations. So this is the question, should the federal government have one? So it's slightly...
This is great. Anyone want to take that one? All of you should.
That's funny. I just, this must be one of my softballs from some friend on Twitter. I just testified to that effect earlier this week to the House Armed Services Committee. And I do believe that the United States government needs a federal CISO. I think the federal CISO's initial job should be to integrate a culture of detection and response into the government. Right now, the government is dominated by what's called continuous diagnostics and mitigation, which basically means going around checking to see which doors and windows are unlocked and then locking them. We need to do that, but we also need someone whose job it is to find out if there's an intruder already in the house. They're already in the house. We saw what happened with OPM. Incidentally, the fact that it was the Chinese doesn't mean that the Russians weren't already in there or some other countries. So we need someone whose job it is to take a look at that. I wouldn't put them in charge of DOD or the intelligence community, but we do need that level of focus. The government is pretty much the only institution left that has gone through a major breach and hasn't realized they need a CISO to deal with it, unlike corporate America.
And I think there we can take lessons from the private sector. Companies that have done the best and do have someone in the CISO position, a very knowledgeable person with a high level of reporting, sometimes to the in the C-suite, or at least to the C-suite, who understands the issues, and as I was saying, ensures an enterprise approach of good cybersecurity hygiene, quick notification, and someone who's on point to respond when issues are detected. And if we use the OPM breach as an example, how many months was it that there was information about this intrusion into the systems of incredibly sensitive information, including mine? And we want to know who's accountable, who's in charge, who do they call? Just as companies need a good incident response plan, our government needs to also work on improving their cross-the-government response.
Actually, on that point, Judy, as far as accountability goes, do small businesses, on the commercial side, do they know who to call? Who is accountable? Is there a clear sense within companies, or is there a lot of confusion still?
More often there's confusion. I think companies who are very large, have a lot of money, have been dealing with breaches for a long time, or sometimes smaller companies who either have been breached or are working with other companies who have a higher level of sensitivity and sophistication to the issues, have a plan. But more often, just one tier below the biggest institutions or those who have been compromised are really struggling, because it can be a very overwhelming issue, this whole concept of cybersecurity and pile on privacy, and in a multifaceted organization, what are the responsibilities? How do we handle this? And often you don't get the right people speaking to each other, and nobody wants to sound dumb or feel dumb. So people who may be very capable of speaking the tech talk may not properly articulate the business interest and business needs of what it means to not do it correctly. And people who are in the C-suite say, sometimes, and they shouldn't, but, I've got tech guys who handle that. That's not my issue. And the litigation that we've seen, both from the regulators and civil litigants now, show that putting your head in the sand is not an effective way, that companies really have to take the leap, admit that, okay, this is really big, I may not understand it, what do I need to know, and what do we do about it? And it's just getting the right people to think about it.
Can I say something
Please.
sort of maybe heretical here? I believe that most American companies need to get out of the IT business. You don't produce electricity for your own use. I think that any new company that's starting now is not building their own IT infrastructure. I'm involved with many startups. We go to the cloud natively. You go to the cloud, you may have your own laptop, but that's it. So the companies that are having trouble now, and including the federal government, are carrying around this huge burden of legacy infrastructure, and they can't patch it, and they can't replace it, and they can't defend it either. So I'm not saying that the cloud is the panacea, and I'm not saying that all cloud providers are equal, but there are some out there who are doing a much better job than any of us could, to include myself as a former tech person who used to run all these sorts of things. I don't run my own mail server. I don't run my own web server. I put it in the hands of professionals who know how to take care of this stuff.
Well, it's a provocative idea. Ellen and Judy, do you think that that's a good solution if you were to advise a startup, on how to be secure, just tell them the expenses are better put in this other area and not building IT from scratch? Is that?
It depends. It depends on the company. I mean, I think that in many cases, and cloud security is a significant issue, but many cases, I do agree with Richard that there are offerings in the cloud, if done in an appropriate way, that are safer than what a certain company would be able to provide on its own. But it's the kind of area, I mean, it was years ago that a senior executive from Cisco said, the cloud is one of the worst, most dangerous things that could have ever happened. We've gotten more sophisticated. There's less fear and trepidation about that. People recognize the cloud can sometimes be better than either an antiquated or insufficient system. But other companies it has to be an intelligent and informed decision. There may be materials that a company decides to keep separate that aren't even access to the internet, and it doesn't need to be. And they need to think about how they are handling all the data. First, they need to figure out what data it is that they're handling, which goes back to the earlier point.
So as someone who works for what you might call one of the original cloud companies, and since I just advocated that all the information in the merchant environment should go to vendors such as ourselves and not be handled within the merchant environment, I would say yes, I completely agree. Now you have the issue, and it was debated extensively 2-3 years ago about the risk of concentration by putting all this information in one place, therefore making it very, very convenient for the criminals that are able to access that particular place. So you have to combine the cloud security idea with very sophisticated cybersecurity within those cloud companies. And I want to just second the points about monitoring and incident response, because I don't think any company at all can guarantee that they have such sufficient controls to keep people from getting into their universe. So I think that monitoring, which is not as easy as it sounds, and incident response, which actually is easier than I think you made it sound, because incident response in cyber is very similar to incident response anywhere else in terms of mobilizing the right people if you just practice in advance. So both those things, I want to second the importance of them.
Right.
Yeah, just briefly, you don't want a dark cloud. You want a transparent cloud. You want a cloud that is telling you where your data is, what's happening to it, who's accessing it, what you can set alerts. You don't want just this bucket out there that you put stuff in and you have no idea what's.
And by the way, just because you put it in the cloud, by the way, doesn't mean you shouldn't be caring about your own incident response just in case that cloud happens to get breached.
Great. On a practical basis, Judy, Rich, and Ellen, if you are a smaller company and you've been breached, who do you call? What is the first thing? What is your first few steps in terms of damage control, in terms of who to call, how to address this? What are you telling your clients?
So it depends on the type and the nature of the breach, but it does help to have an outside advisor lined up ahead of time who can help you think through the issues, practice the issues, be prepared, so when an incident comes, you know who to call, because it's, and then often depending on the incident, it may be something where the federal government can come and be very helpful. And I know with the Sony breach, it was something where a decision was made very quickly. This is bigger than us. We need to call in the federal government, work collaboratively with them. Sometimes there are opportunities where the federal government coming in early can help with proactive efforts to detect and to perhaps even apprehend the perpetrators. Other times it may be a smaller incident, but still something that could, for example, trigger one of the 47 different data breach notification laws that we have in the United States, or all of them. And you need to know, okay, this employee's computer is gone. That may not be something that you need to call the federal government about, but what data was on that computer and why did it have healthcare information of all of our customers when that wasn't part of the employee's job? And then suddenly it could be a more complicated issue than just a missing computer. So it helps to know and think through the issues in advance, but incidents can vary in size and scope, so it depends who you call.
Great. Can you talk a little bit, anyone please weigh in, on the current regulatory environment for data breach and what companies are either struggling with, maybe responding to? There was the very important court decision on the FTC decision to hold Wyndham, for example, liable for its breach information. How are companies responding to that? How are companies navigating the regulatory environment?
Well, I have mixed views on the Wyndham case. In one sense, I don't want to reward companies for not pursuing good security, and I don't know the details of the Wyndham case. But at the same time, I don't like this tendency to blame the victim. We got to remember that any time there's a breach, there's a bad guy who's really at fault. If there weren't a perpetrator, there wouldn't have been a crime.
And so with Wyndham, it was just a few weeks ago that the Third Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals said that Wyndham had challenged whether the FTC had the authority to pursue Wyndham in a civil regulatory action for having for engaging in unfair practices by not having adequate security, basic levels of security. And Wyndham said, first of all, the FTC doesn't have authority for that, and second, there's not sufficient guidelines, if you even had authority, of what we were supposed to be doing, what would constitute unfair practices. And first the district court, and then just last month the circuit court disagreed with Wyndham and said that actually the FTC does have adequate authority and that Wyndham was sufficiently on notice given the number of civil settlements and complaints that had been filed to show what level of harm. But in terms of a company response, the focus really needs to be on preparedness and did the company do what they can? So I also share the concern of, does it make sense to go after companies or is this re-victimizing the victim? But at the same time, the other side of that is, but who's standing up for consumers and encouraging companies to do it? So I do understand both, but the dialogue needs to be not around the liability to the extent as I think what's more important is around, are we doing what we can? We're all going to be hacked. We understand that. We're past that. How do we prepare? What is our our showings, for example, when boards have been sued and they can show, but we were advised by internal experts, we were advised by external experts, we were aware of these security protocols. The fact that we still got breached doesn't mean that we were negligent or uncaring or not following our Caremark duties. We tried.
Well, people should understand that Wyndham was a fairly extreme case. If I'm not mistaken, it was the third time they had been breached, and I believe that influenced the finding by the court. I do find it disturbing that you asked who's the first call, and if you look in the payments industry, if it's a company of any size at all, the first call is always to their lawyer. And their first call should be to a forensic company or someone that can help them immediately contain the breach, protect consumers, and so forth and so on. But generally speaking, it's to their lawyer, and the reason is exactly what we're talking about. So the blame the victim thing has some adverse consequences in the real world when we should be focused on containing the breach and talking to people who can help us, such as law enforcement. So I agree there needs to be a balance, but it is a bit disturbing.
If as the lawyer on the panel, I just want to say, a good lawyer also would have often the forensics firm on speed dial or work very closely with the forensics firm and understand that detection is the concern, but it also can add an added benefit to the extent that there's advice being rendered in a potential civil action that could happen of providing some level potentially of attorney-client privilege with the communications, helping a company walk through that. But it shouldn't be just okay, let's shield this off and not admit anything. It needs to be a very flexible approach of, let's get in the smart people who can look inside the guts of this, figure out what happened, stop it as quickly as possible, and respond in an appropriate way, as opposed to, let's gird for a litigation.
Usually it's both.
Fair point.
So I feel like we just scratched the surface on this topic, and we are unfortunately out of time. I really want to thank Judith Germano, Richard Bejtlich, and Ellen Richey for joining us in Risky Business and talking about the commercial sector impacts of cybersecurity.